DizzyPunch. Hello and welcome to the GM Bus Stop, where I summon people to keep me company while I wait for my bus. I'm Nick, your host for this series, and here with me today is the GM for the Tales of Dalvern on the Strangers Guild podcast, Caleb the Bard.
Woo. Hello and welcome, strangers and friends. This is not the Strangers Guild podcast, but I am honored to be here today at this lovely little bus stop to talk about whatever we get to talking about.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I'm very glad we have you here. You know, you're a great GM. I love the shorts that you guys make, and I think we're going to have a great discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk about the stories that we tell, and the Strangers Guild has a lot to talk about. So I'm excited to see what we get into.
Absolutely. All right, let's head in it then. Your campaign starts with different segments introducing your player characters in interesting and unique ways. We get a glimpse into Dianthus's past, we see Noria's reoccurring dream, and we follow a bit of the day-to-day with Lady M and Yarrow. What was the discussion like when planning their introductions?
Well, the funny thing with D&D or any TTRPG, D&D just happens to be the system that we use for that campaign, is my approach to running a game is player-focused. My common tenet whenever I approach people's characters is intentionality. So as a game master, some people think that they need to, have things set up a certain way, or, they want the first scene to look a certain way. But I found that to tell the most cooperative story is to give your players just a couple prompts and really let them take it away. Of course, prepare. But with Dianthus, with Nordia, it was just a single premise, and then seeing how they dealt and reacted to that premise in their character. So for Nordia, it was a dream, and then how does that character, how does Nordia Thornwood, in the case of our divination wizard, how does she navigate this crazy dream that she's been having? For Dianthus, it was, how does one react to clawing out of their own grave with no memory? And really just letting them decide where the scene goes. I really didn't have too much to say over it, minus asking for a couple rolls. So yeah, really just intentionality and letting the players set the tone just as much as I do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think the very interesting fact about the introductions was that there's a lot of questions to be asked within them. Like, why does Dianthus essentially come in? Some spoilers alert, I suppose, yes, but if you haven't seen the first episode, please do. Please go watch Stranger Things. Stranger Things. Sorry, Strangers Guild
very
podcast.
Different.
Yes. Please go watch the Strangers Guild podcast and come back if you can. But yeah, it just leaves a lot of questions for both Noria and Dianthus about why is Noria having this recurring dream, and why is Dianthus essentially brought back to life. But yeah, it's those things that keep people hooked on to wanting to understand why, and I think that's a very good storytelling in that sense.
Well, it's funny you bring up Stranger Things, not to go totally into that, but it with introducing characters, I think a lot of times people want to be the hero in their story. And I think the way to do that in a way that doesn't take away from other players at the table is give the characters what they fear and what they want at the same time. So for Nordia, she's a dreamer, right? But introducing Nightmare gives both the character and the player the opportunity to fully flesh out their character, right? And if you do that in the character building process with each member of the table, then whenever, even for Yarrow, whose backstory is completely unrelated to Dianthus, whenever you bring that into mind as you kind of start to tell that story, the way that it organically braids and weaves into something that I could have never planned for, it just makes for a really cool story. And that's why I think we tell these kinds of stories, because it makes the imagination of 5 people is much more intense and rich than I could ever dream to come up with.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. A reoccurring thing that we talk about during when I speak to a lot of GMs is that how we imagine the story in one way, and then as we progress and how the players kind of like live through this world, we see things very differently. And I think that's one of the benefits of what we do. The improvisation really tells a story that I don't think we could tell just by trying to write it down, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And it like sometimes one of the players in a scene that is completely unrelated to their character will throw out an idea and you're like, oh my gosh, that's better than what I was doing. And, you tell something that is better than even what I'd written down 2 years ago whenever we started playing this game. So yeah, it's a fun little truth to come across with a group of people. Yeah.
Yeah. Just the key for everyone. Improvisation is the key. Don't write anything down. It's a waste of time.
It can be helpful. Writing stuff down will help the sanity of your players. It can be a little stressful if you're trying to improv an entire interaction. But yeah, sometimes the shopkeep has to come up with, a new item on the fly, and the improvisation is important. So yeah, I definitely, pros and cons to both sides.
Absolutely. I do believe that, all jokes aside, I do believe writing stuff down is important, because at least you need to have like an idea of where you guys are going. As much as I love improvisation, there has to be a motive to everything that works about.
Sure.
And
I think sometimes, people get worried about railroading a character or a story. And as the person running the game, you're worried that the players aren't going to find their way, or, it's not going to be clear enough. But if you give those characters enough, enough magical items, enough cute NPCs, enough crazy big bads, right? They'll find their way, and you'll find that eventually they'll be pulling you along, and you don't have to guide it as much.
Yeah. I think that's a big fear for a lot of GMs, is just the railroading aspect, especially if you have a campaign that's based around mystery. Because, if your players aren't finding the clues properly, then it feels like you have to like force them to move in particular ways. I kind of feel like that way sometimes with our campaign right now, is because there is a mystery aspect to what we're doing, and my players are very much ADHDs, people who easily just be like, oh, who's this? Oh, wait, are you a goo person? Can I drink you? And and then it becomes, guys, you gotta save these people. And it's like, wait, hold on a second, are you wearing shoes or not? Does that work? And then it just goes from there. So sometimes it is necessary to like help push the plot a bit, but give some good room for your players to be able to find the clues, and they'll be able to get them eventually.
Yeah, it definitely it brings the idea and the reminder that it is a home game, even if you're, we have players in different states, in different countries, and even if you're playing a game, in different time zones, it's a game, right? So sometimes, even though you want it to be, Lord of the Rings or Star Trek or whatever genre you're trying to emulate, it is a fun, goofy time with friends. So I think that's kind of a nice reprieve when it comes to telling these kinds of stories.
Yeah. I think you could change genres all you want, but if the vibe of your group is silly, everything you do will end up being silly. That's kind of that's what I've learned recently. It's because we've recently made a one shot of I tried to make it like a dark fairy tale aesthetic, and then it just became silly. Even with that, just because the players just find ways to just make it silly. On one hand, I love it because I love my players. On the other hand, it's like, my intention, no. No. But
I
yeah.
think that's a solid quarter of being a DM is figuring out in what ways you need to reverse psychology yourself and your players' instincts. Because sometimes you'll have a session and you're like, oh, this is going to be a beach episode. And then I don't want to spoil something, but essentially it's like all of the genre elements or the tropes of something that is fun or lighthearted, but just a couple dice rolls or a couple player decisions is can lead it all a different way. So just like a goofy fun party, sometimes introducing something that is the opposite, I found can provide the magnetic result the other way. But yeah, that's a fun thing to think about. It's like, okay, do I make this silly or do I make this serious? And if I start serious, is it going to end serious or vice versa? So yeah, I get that.
Absolutely. Um, let's go on to the next question, shall we? Just because I feel like we actually got that down quite well.
Let's go.
All right. This one's specifically aimed for you. Cal
Oh,
Delmar is one of the main NPCs in your campaign and plays a major role in the group as a vanguard, but also as a love interest to one of the PCs. Spoilers. This is out of speculation, but is Cal like a self-insert of your ideal D&D character?
well, it's funny that you say that. There was a bit of drama on TikTok a while back about whether or not a DM should introduce a DM PC, right? The
Mm-hmm.
idea of inserting yourself as like a main character. And when I was building this campaign, decided that I wanted to cameo a character, right? They weren't meant to hang around too much. But similar to what we were just talking about as to like the impulse of your players, I introduced Cal in the session. You're probably referring to the first episode where he was meant to introduce a another NPC.
Mm-hmm.
Spoilers as to what Perry turns into, but the idea was that Cal was supposed to show up, drop this new character, and then leave. But one of my players ended up locking the door, literally locking the door on him, and making him stuck with the party. And I was like, oh no, the thing I was trying to avoid is happening. And then from there, I was like, well, if Cal's going to be around, I just need to make sure that I don't have him taking any moments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he'll be there to remind characters of a mechanic or to add exposition. Um, but it is funny you say that because I did use him in a home game back a couple years ago now. But yeah, now he's just kind of a little flyboy who hangs around, and you touched on it a little bit, but does supply a little bit of love interest drama to one, and spoilers, maybe more than one of our characters, but that's in future episodes you'll see what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. That's very fascinating.
Um, yeah, so to add on that with the NPC stuff, it's just every NPC, in my opinion, is a DMPC, depending on the mindset and the plot point of that character, right? You can make a villain a DMPC if you're not careful, right? If you make them too powerful or too, dismissive of your character. So I think it's just about balance. It's all, baking. It's all chemistry. You just have to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that once your players introduce kind of how they feel about a character to respond accordingly, whether that be through romance or villainy or mystery or whatever it turns into.
Yeah, I think some of the best NPCs in most campaigns are ones that follow the group. So I don't understand a lot of people who hate when people do create GMPCs, because thinking of the best characters from shows that I love like The Unexpectables or Rush's D&D. So some of the best times with the characters were with these NPCs that kind of like came in, and the GM just like really loved them, and the party really loved them, and it was just a great dynamic. I don't understand why people would be issued with that, to be fair.
Yeah, I think that is just a balance thing.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have, and for different reasons, right? But if someone doesn't feel like they're being considered in a session, I think that could be just a focus for that. On the other side, I have found it funny in more recent sessions where you forget an NPC is there and then a player calls upon them and you're like, oh, I was not preparing the session as this person being there. Time to improv. So there's some fun that can come from having a good Rolodex. You know, I think the DMPC is a problem if they're the only character there, right? Like if your players are trying to explore the world that y'all are building together and you're like, yeah, there's no one else here, that can be a little dismissive. So yeah, I think I just try to have a steady rotation. And if someone's going to stick around, I want that to be with purpose.
Yeah. They also have to have a funny voice. And they have to be interesting in some way. That's the key.
A funny voice, you got to be careful. If the funny voice is too close to another character, sometimes that can be, that can be fun to deal with if they ever have to talk to each other. That is kind of fun as a DM if a player's like, okay, what are these two talking about? And you're like, oh goodness, I gave both of these guys British accents. But yeah, it's fun. It's fun to play with silly voices.
Yeah. It's very awkward, this situation of like, oh wait, I'm having to talk to myself in order to like to play out a scene. Okay. And then it just becomes your players just watching you. And I don't know, it feels like an awkward scenario for me, but I kind of try to like fly by it whenever I can.
I definitely try to physicalize the characters, right? Like to make it awkward or to make it less awkward, I should say, you got to lean into it. So if you're feeling that sense of, oh my gosh, I'm embarrassing myself, or my players are going to think I'm a dork, just leaning into the silly, I think helps them laugh with you and you with them, not at yourself. So yeah, I think something that my players have pointed out is they can always tell what character I'm about to get into because I take a good 2 seconds to physically embody the character before I start the voice. But yeah, it makes for some interesting clips for TikTok or Instagram or sometimes YouTube, whatever. But yeah, I think as DMs, not everyone has to be. I think certain DMs set a high bar for what your voices need to come out as. But as long as you have some sort of verbal or visual indicator between characters, I think your players want the story to succeed. They want to be immersed. So as long as you are putting in effort, I think they'll follow you, no matter how goofy or embarrassing it is.
Right. This kind of reminded me of I mentioned it before, but like on One Piece D&D, Rustage, the GM, he does this thing anytime he plays a character. He has to say a line, like a trigger line, in order to play them, and one of them is the funniest thing that's ever happened. One of them is like based off a character from Brave. So every time he'd have to start the character with his trigger, he would say, "If you could change your fate," and that just became.
Yeah. Would you? Yeah. I don't have a Merida character, but yeah, no, that would definitely be one for me. There's one character going back to Nordia a little bit. She introduces this guy who is based off of a friend of mine on TikTok. Captain Carlson, and basically he now does different media, but he introduced this character called Gunner, and he's always a super gruff guy. So every time I start that voice, I have to imagine myself with a really thick, like animated model jawline, right? Like he's a total Chad. The character is great, but I always have to go into that being like a bit of a grunt, right? Like I have to be a bigger, like I have to take up more space, be bigger than I am. So I just think it's fun to find different ways to kind of push yourself, I think, because obviously we're not all little. Is Merida's Scottish, right? We're not little Scottish girls. But you get to play that at the table, and I think it's a good time.
Yeah, taking inspiration from people you know is always fun, but sometimes I've gotten comments of people who I've told them that I played a character based on them, and they had came back with notes of like, so
Sure, sure.
yeah, Reggie, one of the guys, not a person in the camp, but an NPC that I play. Is actually based off a friend of mine. I told him he was based on it, but he has a Jamaican accent, and I was like, bro, I'm not, I can't do a Jamaican accent.
Sure, sure.
I'm not gonna play this. And then I just gave him kind of like very rough, like low voice, because that's typically how he sounds with that very low sense. And then he watched it and was like, hey man, what you doing?
Sure, sure.
But
I
yeah,
think the important thing, especially with people you know, right, is to communicate with them before and after, because you never want to make a decision that that person wouldn't make. Um, but as long as you have the understanding of, hey, I like this character, or I like the way that you've presented this, cosplay or whatever. Is it cool if I do this? As long as they give you those notes and that feedback beforehand, you should be good, right?
yeah.
You always just want to be mindful of that. But yeah, it is funny when they're like, yeah, no, my voice isn't that deep, or, like, I liked what you did there, but that's not how that feat works. And I'm like, sometimes improv means we have to rule of cool the situation.
Absolutely. I hate it when people come back to you and say like, "Hey, you don't know how this spell works." And I'm like, "Okay, that's constructive. Thank you." I listen, it's all about what it is in the moment and being fun and having fun with it. And if people don't like it,
I
yeah.
I would be way more, I guess, like by the book about spells if it was an in-person game and we're going like full minis and like paper, everything's physical. But I feel like with theater of the mind, you kind of have to bend the rules a little bit, because I would hate to be the DM that's like, oh yeah, you're not close enough to this person to cast this spell. If you're describing the situation and they're like, well, how far are you? I don't want to say, oh yeah, they're 300 feet away, and make their really cool spell or idea become moot because I just built the room different in my head than I described it to my player. So yeah, when people are like, oh, this isn't how that spell, or this isn't how this character class works, I'm like, my character said they wanted to fly and have really gnarly wings. I'm gonna make that happen. That sort of thing.
Yeah. Rule of cool, guys. Rule of cool.
Rule of cool. The rules, in the book, the book's always changing, right? So as
Yeah.
long as your players know which book you're referring to, they can be good. I think they can be helpful in the way that I like to use like the rule of like rules as written is to show how serious the situation is, right? Because if someone knows how many hit points they have, say you have 80 hit points, and I, say that the big bad hits you for 75 hit points, that's a way that the rules can reflect the severity of the situation. But on the other end, if my character does something and the spell is only 1d8, but they rolled a natural 20 and the effect was really cool and it would help everyone feel really cool about what's happening, I like to blend it that way. So I think that's just a fun way to balance both.
Yeah, there is no perfect system out there, and there are certainly flaws with 5e or like whatever module that you're using. If I had to recall a moment where something wasn't working very, or something didn't make sense, there was a moment where a character wanted to use the hide action, but then they're in full view of a person, and then we're like, how are we going to apply? You could technically apply the hide action, but it doesn't make sense in the setting. So the fun kind of imaginary thing we said, because they're like a whether. What is that race called where they're goopy? Plasmoid. Where they're a plasmoid.
Oh, sure.
I said, you just explode. And then I said, okay. And then they just like, all their parts are just scattered around everywhere. And then the person's like, okay, what do I stab now in order to hurt this thing? And that's kind of like where the hide action is like you're hiding your important bits. And that was kind of the fun way of like how we can make this seem more real. But it's all about finding imaginative ways to problem solve is always the best key in these like weird scenarios.
And honestly, you bring up a good point with in encounters, I feel like when I first started DMing, I would make combat way too complicated. I think if you put in like 1, 2, max 3 mechanics in the combat, your players will find a way to break it so fast that it'll be fun, it'll be creative, it'll be new. So with like a plasmoid character, right? Like there's enough chaos baked into that you don't have to do as much work as I think a lot of DMs think that they have to. But yeah, that is a fun little way of the rule of cool that though. I might steal that.
Go ahead, man. I probably stole it somewhere else, and I don't remember. We'll say it's fine. But yeah, when I plan my like, I always have to say is that if you don't want combat in your campaign, if you're a campaign that doesn't want it, you don't have to apply it. It's
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
something it's something if you want to gamify things, you certainly can. When I plan encounters, it's all about how do I make one thing different from the next, and how I make things interesting. So nothing's ever the same twice in that sense. Even if they're fighting the same enemies, there's always going to be another element to it. And that's how I make combat fun. And it's all about, if you really want to do combat, you have to think about what would you want to make combat fun for. How is this going to make your players feel fun in the moment? Because I have one player who loves combat and loves the rules, is a real rule person, and then I have two other people who are like, I'm fine, I know them, but I don't really care too much. And
Yeah. I do this thing called 0.0 sessions where, we'll get to episode 5, right? We'll do the episode. And then after that, a player afterwards will be like, hey, I don't really like how this worked or whatever. And then I'll do like a 0.0 session, which is essentially a session 0, just later on in the campaign, just to make sure that their character build and ideas of roleplay and combat are how they want it to go. Sometimes that could be, evaluating their character voice. Sometimes that could be, balancing their stats or their feats or that sort of thing. So yeah, I think combat is a heavy focus, especially in D&D, but I think it's important to realize that just like going out for a meal, right? The desire of your table can change over time. So I always, like I said, those 0.0 sessions really help me kind of put focus and make new direction when it comes to combat versus roleplay versus puzzles, etc.
that's a great metaphor to use as you're at a dinner table and everyone wants to order something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's okay if, everyone wanted the steak before, but, sometimes people want a salad.
Yeah.
Someone wants dessert, that sort of thing. Someone wants a ball episode, that sort of thing. So
A ball episode.
a classic. Can
Yeah.
never go wrong with a nice high fantasy dance, with, a little bit of interruption, but some wine and some dancing is always fun for your players. So
Absolutely. Let's go on to the next question then. Dungeons and Dragons as content has exploded these past couple of years, and now we have multiple ways of enjoying it, such as watching live streams, listening to podcasts, and watching dedicated productions such as Dimension 20 or Tales Unwritten. What is your preferred way of enjoying D&D content?
So it's funny because there's a couple different ways I can take that, right? Of course, I love the classics, Critical Role, Dimension 20. There's NADPOD. There's all sorts of different big, your typical ideas of what a TTRPG looks like. But I love to be surprised, right? Sometimes people will introduce a new system and I'll be like, yo, Kids on Bikes, Call of Cthulhu, this is crazy monster of the week. There's all sorts of really cool ways that a story can be told. And I think the most satisfied I've been, of course, the original, the classics, right, are fun, but finding a new story is really fun. So whether that be through TikTok or I see an Instagram reel and I'm like, what is this character about? I think just little bits that bring me to a really cool story I never would have been brought to is kind of my favorite. So I will watch YouTube videos at double speed because sometimes there's dead moments, or I need my ADHD brain. I need stimulus, right? So sometimes I just listen to it a little faster. But yeah, basically wherever you get your podcast. But any sort of new system is always fun for me, because I think sometimes as a DM, you start to, even though you're trying to listen to the story, you'll start to DM a situation, even though it's a different table. And so I try to refresh my systems uh, in order to avoid that. Like, you don't want to be thinking too much about hit points or initiative or whatever if people are describing their dungeon crawl. So hope that answers it. Again, a little bit of ADHD, a little bit of everywhere, but yeah. So any sort of short form content that leads me to longer form is always fun, always a good time.
Yeah, that's always interesting. I asked this question because I kind of like to hear a lot. I've asked this question not on interviews yet, but more on just people in person, because I've kind of realized how most of the time I enjoy listening to podcasts because I've traveled a lot, and it's very difficult to watch stuff more often like Dimension 20 or like live streams. So it's nice to hear like the pre-recorded stuff, and that's kind of what kind of got me into wanting to do a lot more podcast-based stuff with our own campaign. But there's such a gray amount of content out there for everything. You've said yourself, there are like shorts on social medias, live streams. I was listening to your content before, like the podcast version of the Strangers Guild, and then I was curious to see how you guys were on video format, and I watched it and I was like, wow, the video format is so good because I get to see everyone's reactions, and they all have great reactions to things.
It's good. It's good because, we're human, right? If we were paid to do this full time, we could crank out way more content than we currently are. However, the the podcasts are so fun. Icarus does a great job. I'll leave their socials for you later of editing that in both the audio and the video format. But we are in our live streams on Caleb the Bard, the Twitch channel that we stream from, which is, of course, it is my personal Twitch, but it's also where the Stranger Guild projects lie, just because we are always telling different types of stories, that sort of thing. We had a charity stream just a few weeks ago now. I want to say that was June 1st. I don't want to lie to you. I'll make sure to get the right info for you. Yeah. But essentially, the stories, whether you're listening to just straight produced audio, that can be nice to see stuff that is clean cut, formatted. But we also do live stream our content. So it's a little bit of both. And we're not the only people who do that, of course. But it is interesting comparing. I have friends with Cast Party who do all sorts of different types of streams. They pre-record their content and then edit the audio individually and then put it all together, versus our stream where we have to pull everything from OBS and just hope that Icarus can string it together. So it's definitely different for all sorts of groups, whether you're based in the States or across the pond, as they say. But yeah, a lot of different styles, a lot of different ways to consume it. And I think that's what the cool thing is, because some people have never seen a single episode of Critical Role or Dimension 20, but still love the game, right? And then some people, they've seen every episode of every campaign of their favorite dungeon master, but they can always be surprised by, an episode or a character. Even before funny story, I had actually seen Dimension 20. Fantasy High was my first exposure to D&D, and then I watched some of the other more traditional forms of it. So it's definitely interesting just how people come to the table, and in that instance how they come to their favorite podcasts or YouTube channel, or however it is that they consume their content.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thinking about it, my first exposure to D&D was, oh wow, it was like during the pandemic. it was a while ago. It was at a time where there's not a huge amount of content to search up. So I was watching old episodes of Team Four Stars Dragon Ball, and one of the people voicing one of the characters, uh, Takahata 101, was doing a series called The Unexpectables, which I've mentioned before, and then I just started listening to it, and then just got really interested. And I didn't know anything that was going on at the time because I had no idea what the rules were or how this whole thing worked, but I just liked the characters, and that's how I kind of got into it myself.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where you get people that are super elitist about it, right? If they're like, "Oh, you don't know, the third edition of D&D, you don't know D&D, right?" Or this one was better, or D&D 5e is like prime. But then I know people who have completely wrote off D&D completely and have told other role-playing games, and I think they've produced in some ways better content just because they've become more intentional about the type of stories they want to tell. Obviously I am partial to D&D. I love the game. But I think holding space for like that mindfulness of just, hey, people want to play different things, people want to do different things, and then holding space for people, I think that is a reward in and of itself, but it also tells really cool stories. And yeah, just provides for some really cool ways, whether that's from Team Four Star or Dimension 20, just all sorts of gateway. It's not a gateway drug in the negative sense, but it
In a good
is a
way.
little bit of it in a good way. Good drugs. It gets people into it in a way that is it'll hook you.
Hmm.
That's for sure. I'm definitely a dice goblin, but there's some things that can be fun things to be addicted to. So um,
Yeah.
especially in the space of telling stories, right? But
Mhm.
it is a good rush, and I think a very rewarding way to kind of grow. Like we were talking about earlier with the voices, right? It kind of shows you a different way to express yourself in a format that, with if you had never seen it or never tried it, it's not super organic, right? You're never going to, hopefully, be running through a forest, cleaving monsters with an axe, but it can teach you a lot about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are so many people who love improvisation and love acting and just love playing with characters that D&D just comes very natural to people, or just role play games in general comes very natural. For example, Sword AF, which is something that Smosh is doing right now, where they have a bunch of the main cast just trying out D&D. They didn't have a lot of experience, but what what the benefit was with them is that they could jump into their characters and understand how that works. And this world of D&D helps with decision making just with dice rolls in that sense. And that's once they understood how that worked, things became so much not happier, but like so much entertaining for them, and you can see it with their expressions and how they play, and that's the one of the beautiful aspects of D&D in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's much more rewarding to teach someone how to do something and watch them get it, or watch them show you a new way to do it, than it is to just be better, right? I see a lot of people talking about D&D or, a TTRPG where they're, oh, I'll never be, insert your favorite player here. And it's like, no, you won't be that person. But I know without a shadow of a doubt, if that person heard you say that, they'd be like, well, I couldn't tell the stories you tell, right? For me, on Dimension 20, Lou Wilson's probably my favorite, but I'm sure Lou Wilson would completely understand that we tell completely different stories. Same, with Liam O'Brien, with Ali Beardsley, with, Abri Iyengar. Like, everyone has just inherently a different direction. Um, but I think, as you bring people to the table, uh, it literally it just makes you better. I tell people, the best way to be, and part of the reason I go by Caleb the Bard isn't because I think I'm the best performer, which most people will tell you that I'm not. It's the goal and the drive to be a jack of all trades and to tell stories with people and to expand my skill tree, and by doing that, I, through the Strangers Guild, bring people to the table.
Right. I just call myself Nick because it's the simplest thing I can think of.
That's okay.
Yeah. But no, it's great points that you're making, and I think there's so many beautiful aspects of D&D, and I'm just very appreciative that I can discuss it with like-minded people like yourself and any other. And that's one of my favorite parts about doing this podcast and working with people, is that we can do stuff like this. And yeah,
it's definitely a good time. And I start every stream with hello, strangers and friends, because whether you are friends of mine or strangers to the table, there's always a cool story to tell. And by getting someone's input, right, like this conversation might just marginally change the way that I DM or the way that I play at a table, and the same hopefully for yourself or whoever listens. And I think that's a really cool aspect of D&D, where it's like there's not just one way to play, but even at one table there's not just one way to approach and to cultivate those stories.
Absolutely. Next, no, I don't want to do that was a hard turn, but let's try to get something in there.
You're good.
As you can see, this is the most commonly asked question I give everyone. As you can see by my side, I have a magical vending machine which can summon any snack at your disposal. What is your go-to snack or beverage whenever playing D&D?
So, this is a good one. For me personally, I'll answer both. My go-to snack, I can sometimes run low on sugar. So I like those Sour Patch watermelons.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the Sour Patch Kids, but they're specifically little watermelon slices. Those are my favorite go-to snack. And then as far as drink, I am a sucker for a Earl Grey with cream and sugar. It makes me feel like I'm playing D&D. You can ask my players. I almost always am stirring my little mug and, sipping away. And it just makes it to where, if I'm the villain, it gives me some tea to sip. Or if I'm playing, a nice down-to-earth NPC, it keeps me grounded. So it's a little bit of both, of, being of this world and part of the fantasy. So yeah, I try not to have those together. Don't always mix. But, always want to stay hydrated and have snacks. But yeah, I'm definitely a snacker.
That's funny. When you ever have to play the villain in a scene, do you you do not get watermelons, villain?
Well, it's funny because it has happened before where you think you have a moment, right? You deliver, a monologue or, bring up a scene. And that's always the moment that they ask you a question. It's always the moment where it's like, hey, DM, oh no, I have this mouthful of, whatever sweet treat. And you just kind of have to roll with it.
Yeah.
And part of the thing with, streaming and, the magic of post-production is sometimes if you flub a line, you can just do it again. And that's kind of what I like about, one thing I like about streaming and, kind of putting out the content is being able to tell the story as you mean for it to be, not always
as it is.
As is. Pros and cons to both sides, though.
Yeah. My answer to this was always the same of I'm a munch goblin, so anything in front of me I'll eat. Typically, in my old D&D games, my old GM would invite us to their house, and then they'd cook us a meal and we'd eat, and then I'd bring sour Twizzlers, and then he would take everything and just he'd take them and just eat them and use them as pointers to certain things. Recently, as a snack form, I've been making fruit leather out of watermelon and cherries.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Some kind of some dried, almost like jerky type of deal. Okay.
Yeah. It's imagine a fruit roll up, but
Okay, yeah.
healthy.
Yeah, I would say, I'll raise you this. Is there a snack that you found that you need to avoid? Either with a bad experience, or being like it would distract. For me, it would be I love salted almonds, but I found that if I eat them during a session, it'll dry out my voice and then I start coughing or something. So I've had to avoid them specifically while we're at the table.
You should tell Brendan Lee Mulligan that because he hasn't gotten that memo yet.
And some people can do it, but I need hydration and I
Yeah.
need, I, I need a clear surface.
hmm I I guess for me, I have a bad history with double stuffed Oreos.
Mm.
I brought it one time to a game. No one was eating it, and I was like, okay, I'll eat it. And then I just ate a whole pack, not like a small 4x4. It was like one of those very long ones. And then I
Yeah.
just had like a stomach bug for what felt like a month. So Oreos have kind of been banned from my vicinity ever since.
Yeah, the sugar crash
hmm
hangover, I'm sure was crazy. Yeah, it's definitely different, especially people talk about, TTRPGs, right, as kids games,
hmm
but a lot of us are adults and we can't really play like we could when we were kids. And
hmm
that goes to snacking as well. So that's always a brutal reminder, but fun to think about.
I'm not sure fun is the right word to say, but like
Sure, sure.
it just reminds you of your own morality. Yeah, sure, I can't eat Krispy Kremes anymore, but yeah, as my
Hey, it's a Constitution save.
yeah. This is funny. Elves should have like minus constitution. If they like as older as they get, they should have like a -6.
That that is a fun way to talk about. We were talking about like rule of cool versus rules as written. Sometimes a player, just in the way that they bring something up, even if they have an immunity to something, or like elves are this way or whatever. It's sometimes I'm like, I know you don't need to sleep, but if you want to in this situation, that is totally fine. And for example, like if elves are dealing with something and they're a little older, it's like, okay, yes, I know that this magic effect when normally, but you also said you were going to drink an entire tub of ale. Do you want to roll a con save anyway? I think that's just a fun way to kind
Yeah,
of sprinkle things up.
none of that Legolas bullshit of him just like drinking as much as the dwarf and just being.
Hey,
I'm
if your players want to do that, cool, fine, go ahead. But I think, especially at our table, there's like a certain level of like, hey, I'll let y'all get away with some stuff. But if you push it, something's gonna happen. This last game, the episode isn't out yet. Um, I guess technically you could see the VOD on Twitch, but you would be missing some context. But sometimes you'll do something really cool, and it'll be a nice, really cool moment. But sometimes the dice tell a different story, and I think that's a fun aspect of it.
Yeah, I remember like I think it was the first or second episode where you were one of the players was complimenting you on the fact that you kept as every time someone wanted to do something, you're like roll for it. Yeah, come on. yeah.
Well, it's funny too because people, sometimes the roles can distract from the game, or like it can slow it down in a way that's a little tough. But I usually like to say roll for it in a situation one where I need to improvise, or if the player knows that they're pushing it, I don't want to say no, right? Like Caleb, the human person, right? Would say, hey, that's probably not possible, right? That's probably, not doable in this situation. But as a DM, I'm like, I would say no, but let's let the dice say. And that way I'm never the bad guy, even if I'm playing the bad guy.
Absolutely.
So yeah, if I'm asking my players to roll for it a lot, you can tell that they have found a thing that is not necessarily something I don't want them to do, but something where I'm like, okay, I'm putting obstacles in your path not because I don't want you to succeed, but because you are level 3 and I want you to understand, that this might have consequences. So
Yeah, I think anytime the player says something of like, "Oh, my character feels sick," and it's like, "Okay, roll a Constitution saving throw," and then we're like, "Wait, I didn't mean it like that." No, you said it. Roll it.
there's an example I think it's in the first season, where the character is like, okay, so I'm gonna take this, and I don't want to spoil it for them, but without context, they're like, I want to throw this through this piece of paper and have it pin up against the wall, and I'm like, okay, roll a sleight of hand, and they're like, oh wait, I forgot that some of my actions aren't just things that I do, and I'm like, it might be really cool. Spoiler alert, it did end up being pretty cool. But it is funny in situations like that, just to remind your players that, like, yeah, this is a collaborative story, but we're also at a table, and and other people are here. So, I always like to say, as a DM and as a player, a natural 20 is just as, fun and exciting as a 3. Just because I think showing what your character looks like failing can show sometimes more than if they crit on a roll. So
Yeah.
so yeah, always having the possibility for high level success, high level failure, and then developing a aura, a atmosphere at the table where your players know that even if they fail in something they really wanted to succeed, later on you're going to give them a chance at redemption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the way it is. That's the way it should be. That's the way it always will be.
That's the way it always was. Yeah.
Yeah. Real quick, I wanted to spotlight some of the people on your team. Your artwork is done by Freckleworks, who plays Yarrow in your series, and makes the amazing animatics on your social media, as well as the animated intro of Tales of Tavern. Your backgrounds are made by Derek D&D, and the music in your intro is composed and sung by Emilymcnallysings. And I believe you said before that Icarus does the editing, which is very well done.
Yeah, so all of our work, we try to the Strangers Guild, right? The idea is that if I had the money, if I had the funds to have us all quit our jobs and tell these stories, I would pay for everyone to do the things, right? That's the dream, maybe someday. But in the meantime, if anyone does something, whether it's paid or unpaid, based off of people's, needs and experience, they're always highlighted. So, for example, we always shout out our collaborators in our, descriptions of our videos, or in the intro, or the commercial break in the middle. So, so Emily and Freckle and Icarus, anyone who works with the Strangers Guild, either as a player or DM, they always get some sort of visual, if not verbal, shout out.
That's always great to do. I think appreciation is one of the best forms of flattery.
Yeah. And it definitely allows for people to network in a way. I think one of my least favorite things about D&D is that there's so much content that you can't get to it all. And so sometimes I'll be talking to people and they'll refer to a podcast. I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't heard of that. Now I got to get into that. So it's a good problem to have. But with my table and with my players and everyone that I work with, I try to give a little bit of a shout out, even if it's not, even if we don't have an episode that day. If I'm just streaming, Baldur's Gate or something, I still try to talk about the people that I collab with.
Yeah, and it's an amazing team you have. I mean, it's great to surround yourself with people who are not only very talented, but also have a passion for what you're doing.
Yeah, and I'll drop some of the players' socials for you, kind of in post.
I'll also animate kind of like, as in the video portion, I'll animate kind of like some of the artwork and the socials of everyone else, so you'll be able to see it as well.
Cool. Yeah, so we have, because Icarus right, does the production, but they also play Dianthus, right?
Hmm.
Freckle does the art, but they also play Yarrow.
Hmm.
We have Betty the Beholder, who plays Lady M. Sabrina, BBEGBrina does our uh, most of our charity work stuff. So we did a uh, Pass the Hat level charity stream a few weeks ago. They ran all that sort of stuff. So the Strangers Guild is always looking for more people to tell stories with, whether that be in America or elsewhere. I think we're at 4 countries now as far as where people have been from to tell our stories. Um, but yeah, and always working on right now. We're actually working on developing a couple new campaigns, a couple new tables. So always kind of dropping little nuggets, whether that be on Discord or TikTok or YouTube.
Lovely. And speaking of which, we are nearing the end as I see the bus in the horizon. I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to chat with me. You can take this time to shout out any upcoming projects or series you guys are working on.
Yeah, so I would say check out the Strangers Guild on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and wherever you get your podcasts. We are on Spotify. We stream normally on Sundays. As life is different for everybody, sometimes those are on different days. They surprise people. But that is on Caleb the Bard _ just because apparently someone took Caleb the Bard, unfortunately. But yeah, so we have our Tales of Dalvern stream going. We are currently in season 3 on the live stream, but our first season is wrapping up on all of our postings and that sort of thing. But we are going to be releasing some ways to access, some exclusive content. But I'm also recruiting right now for different. I don't spoil what the campaigns are going to be about, but there are 4 different tables that we are working on producing content for. So check out our socials, whether that's mine, but honestly, Caleb the Bard is, he's just here to help give bardic inspiration to my guild and my guild members. So, and anything else that I forget to mention, I'll try to drop in any sort of comments, or I'll make sure that Nick knows who to shout out.
All right, perfect. I hope everyone enjoyed the podcast. If you guys don't like it, well, too bad. I'm going to keep doing it. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.